So without an integration layer, essentially, there are connections between all of these boxes here along the top with all of these boxes at the bottom. Now, I could start drawing in the connections, but to be honest, my head would explode. There are too many connections going on. So, hi folks, Greg Heaslip here in PlanDomino again. Thanks for coming back. So, in the previous video, we looked at we introduced the idea of the UNS, the Unified Namespace, or the integration layer. And this is basically for a manufacturing plant. So we want to move on to the labs, which is really what PlanDomino is interested in, and I would imagine most of this audience is interested in as well. And we want to talk about how it fits into this overall digital strategy. So I'm going to get rid of this, and maybe we'll put up something that represents the lab. Maybe before I delete it, is the first thing you might notice about this is how structured it is. And when we get onto the labs, maybe you'll notice that there's a bit of a looser structure. It's not as kind of stacked as this as such. Okay, so we'll start again with the blank slate for the labs. So typically in a lab, maybe we can start off with the hardware and maybe the instruments. So we'll always have maybe enterprise or PC-based instruments. We more than likely have standalone units, so maybe a pH meter or a balance or something like that. And then after that, we may have some sort of streaming or continuous data that's coming in. So for the most part, this really represents our hardware, so our instruments. If we were to make an analogy with the previous board, really this is our PLCs, I suppose, and our actuators and our sensors. And this, I suppose, they sit right down at the bottom here. And these are the kind of on the ground, these are physical pieces of equipment. And then when we talk about actual systems and software that we have in the laboratory, so we could have maybe a scientific data management system. We more than likely have a LIMS system, maybe some sort of electronic notebook, or a lab execution system. We could also potentially have maybe some sort of analytics system. Data analytics. We could also have, depending on how advanced your lab is, you might have some sort of data lake or maybe data warehouse. So a data warehouse potentially that you're feeding your data into, so or potentially a data lake. And essentially the difference between a data warehouse and a data lake is a warehouse is very structured data, almost like a database, and a data lake is looser structure to it. So you can feed an awful lot of different types of data into it that are not necessarily relational databases, and it's kind of a looser structure for it, something that really is ideal for machine learning and feeding into the cloud. So I suppose in a traditional laboratory that's currently operating in most pharmaceutical manufacturing plants, we probably have some or all of these systems in place. Certainly we would have, for the most part, we'd have LIMS systems, an SDMS or a CMS, and obviously we're going to have all of our instruments in place, and potentially some analytics, maybe not a data lake connected up to AI ML. So without an integration layer, essentially there are connections between all of these boxes here along the top with all of these boxes at the bottom. Now I could start drawing in the connections, but to be honest, my head would explode. There are too many connections going on. So there are some companies that are working on what we call an integration layer, which is essentially the same thing as the unified namespace. Although it's a little more structured, and there's probably a bit more to it. So this is what we would call as the integration layer here, where essentially we've got all of these feeding in to this integration layer. And there are some companies who are developing systems to allow us to develop this integration layer. As I mentioned before, building and developing integrations is a very expensive business. So ideally what we want to have is an integration layer that is just like our Industry 4.0 unified namespace, is that it plays well with all other systems. It allows us to connect in whatever instruments that we have. It allows us to connect in whatever bits of software or systems that we have, and essentially it acts like the unified namespace. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the previous video, this integration layer really has to take into consideration that we also want to feed into our unified namespace, which is our manufacturing plant's system. So this needs to be taken into consideration. And of course, there is one very essential bit of software that's missing from here, and that's our scheduling system, which is obviously PlanDomino. Well, it may not be that obvious, but essentially PlanDomino is a scheduling system. And of course, ideally, we'll have our scheduling system hooked into our integration layer. But to be honest, that's not enough, just integrating all of this, because this is essentially a siloed system. So what we want to do is we want to take this system and we want to integrate it into our unified namespace. And really, in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show kind of data that we want to get from our unified namespace, and what kind of data do we want to publish up. Essentially, what we want is we want this integration layer to play well with our unified namespace.